The letter from Boston arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1884, and Clara Oliverson held it with trembling fingers as she stood on the wooden platform of the train station in Mojave, California, knowing her father would never approve of what she had done. The dusty frontier town stretched before her like a foreign country, all sun-bleached wood and endless sky, so different from the brick buildings and manicured gardens of her childhood that she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But there was no turning back now. She had signed a contract to teach at the Mojave schoolhouse for 1 year, and Clara Oliverson never broke her promises. The schoolhouse itself sat at the edge of town, a simple structure that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind. Clara arrived with her 2 trunks and her carefully packed books, greeted by the town council, consisting of 3 weathered men who looked at her with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright dismay. She was 23 years old, a graduate of the Boston Female Academy, fluent in Latin and French, well-versed in literature and mathematics and natural sciences. She had read Chaucer and Shakespeare, studied the great philosophers, and could recite poetry in 3 languages. The problem, as she would soon discover, was that none of this impressed the rough men of Mojave, who wanted a teacher for their children but did not quite know what to do with an educated woman. The first week passed in a blur of introductions and awkward silences. Clara met the families whose children would attend her school, and she saw the way the men would nod politely before finding excuses to leave the conversation. The women were kinder, but equally puzzled by her references to classical literature and scientific theories. At the boarding house where she took her meals, the other residents treated her with a strange mixture of respect and distance, as though she were a curiosity to be admired from afar but never truly understood. It was on her 8th day in Mojave that she first saw Daniel Sullivan. She had been walking back from the general store, her arms full of supplies for the schoolhouse, when a group of cattle came thundering down the main street. Clara froze, uncertain which way to move, her heart pounding as the dust rose around her in choking clouds. Then suddenly there were hands on her waist, strong and sure, lifting her clear off the ground and carrying her to the wooden sidewalk in one smooth motion. She found herself looking up into a pair of startling blue eyes set in a sun-bronzed face, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. "You all right, miss?" His voice was deep and slightly rough, with a hint of concern that seemed genuine. "Yes, thank you," Clara managed, trying to gather her scattered packages. "I should have been more careful." He bent to help her, moving with an easy grace despite his height and broad shoulders. He wore the typical clothing of a ranch hand, dusty boots and worn denim, a hat pushed back to reveal dark hair that needed cutting. But his eyes were intelligent, watching her with an alertness that made her think there was more to him than first appeared. "You must be the new schoolteacher," he said, handing her the last of her packages. "Daniel Sullivan. I work at the Riverside Ranch about 5 miles east of town." Clara Oliverson. She adjusted her grip on the supplies, very aware that people were watching them. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Sullivan. Just doing what any decent person would do." He tipped his hat. "Welcome to Mojave, Miss Oliverson. I hope the town treats you well." He walked away before she could respond, his long stride carrying him down the street toward the saloon. Clara watched him go, puzzled by the brief encounter. There had been something different about him, something she could not quite name. Most of the men she had met barely made eye contact, as though her education made her too foreign to approach. But Daniel Sullivan had looked at her directly, without fear or dismissal, just simple human kindness. The school opened on Monday morning with 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 15. Clara threw herself into teaching with all the passion and dedication she possessed, determined to prove that education could transform lives even in this rough frontier town. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and geography, history and natural sciences. She brought out her cherished books and read to the children, watching their faces light up with wonder at stories of far-off places and great adventures. But the longer she stayed in Mojave, the more she felt the weight of her isolation. The other unmarried women in town were younger, less educated, content to spend their time preparing for marriage and domesticity. The married women were kind but busy with their own families, and they seemed to view Clara as something of an oddity, a woman who had chosen books over babies, education over marriage. The men were worse. They would tip their hats politely when she passed, but she could see the wariness in their eyes, the way they seemed to think her intelligence was something threatening or unnatural. On a Friday afternoon in early October, Clara was closing up the schoolhouse when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Daniel Sullivan standing on the step, his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, surprised. "Is something wrong?" "No, miss, nothing wrong. I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment if you have the time." Clara stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. The schoolhouse was her domain, the one place where she felt truly comfortable in this strange new world. Daniel looked around at the carefully organized desks, the slate board covered with the day's lessons, the books lined up on makeshift shelves. "I heard you are a fine teacher," he said after a moment. "The children talk about nothing else when they come home, stories about ancient Rome and the planets in the sky and all manner of things." "I try to open their minds to the wider world," Clara said, pleased by the compliment. "Education is the key to opportunity. That is what I wanted to talk to you about." Daniel turned to face her, and she was struck again by the directness of his gaze. "I never had much schooling myself. Came west when I was 15, been working cattle ever since. But I have always wanted to learn more, to understand the things educated people talk about. I have tried to teach myself from books, but it is hard going alone." Clara felt a flutter of something in her chest, a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "What exactly are you asking, Mr. Sullivan?" "I was hoping you might consider teaching me. Private lessons in the evenings after your regular school day. I can pay you, of course. Not much, but something for your time." She studied him, trying to understand his motivation. In her experience, most men would rather die than admit ignorance, especially to a woman. But Daniel Sullivan stood before her with no pretense, no false pride, just honest desire to better himself. "I do not need payment," she said slowly. "But I would be happy to help you if you are truly serious about learning." His face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. "I am serious, Miss Oliverson, more serious than I have been about anything in a long time." They agreed to meet twice a week after supper at the schoolhouse. Daniel would arrive as the sun was setting, washing at the pump outside before entering, always polite and respectful. Clara started with the basics, assessing what he already knew, and was pleasantly surprised to discover he could read fairly well and had a natural aptitude for mathematics. What he lacked was formal education, the structured learning that would connect his scattered knowledge into a coherent whole. As October turned to November, their lessons became the highlight of Clara's week. Daniel was an eager student, asking thoughtful questions and working diligently on the assignments she gave him. But more than that, he was the first person in Mojave who seemed to truly value her education rather than fear it. When she explained complex concepts, he listened with genuine interest. When she quoted from literature or philosophy, he wanted to understand the context and meaning. For the first time since arriving in California, Clara felt like she had found someone who could meet her on her own intellectual ground. One evening in mid-November, after they had finished working through a particularly challenging passage from Milton's Paradise Lost, Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. "Can I ask you something personal, Miss Oliverson?" Clara felt a flutter of nervousness but nodded. "Of course. Why did you come here? A woman with your education could have stayed in Boston, taught at a fine school, married some professor or businessman. What made you choose Mojave?" The question cut deeper than he knew. Clara set down her book and folded her hands in her lap, choosing her words carefully. "In Boston, I was too educated for my own good. The men I met either wanted a decorative wife who would never challenge them, or they were put off by a woman who had read more books than they had. My father despaired of me ever marrying. He said I had made myself unmarriageable with all my studying and thinking." "That seems like a foolish thing to say," Daniel said quietly. "Perhaps, but it was true enough. I received 3 marriage proposals before I left Boston. One from a man twice my age who wanted someone to care for his 5 children. One from a merchant who made it clear he expected me to give up teaching once we wed. And one from a gentleman who actually told me he found my intelligence intimidating, but was willing to overlook it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And you turned them all down?" "I did. I wanted to go somewhere new, somewhere I could use my education to make a real difference. The frontier needs teachers, needs people who believe in the power of learning. I thought perhaps out here, away from society's rigid expectations, I could find my place." "Have you found it?" Clara met his eyes and felt something shift between them, a recognition that went beyond teacher and student. "I am beginning to think I might." The conversation stayed with Clara long after Daniel left that night. She lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house, listening to the wind howl across the desert, and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. She had come to Mojave expecting to find purpose in teaching children, and she had found that. But she had not expected to find a connection with a cowboy who asked her to teach him about poetry and philosophy, who looked at her education not with fear or resentment, but with respect and admiration. December brought cooler weather and preparations for the Christmas season. The school put on a small pageant, and Clara was touched to see how many families attended, including several of the ranch hands from the surrounding spreads. Daniel was there, standing at the back of the crowded schoolhouse, and when their eyes met across the room, he smiled at her with such warmth that she felt her cheeks flush. After the pageant, as parents collected their children and the crowd began to disperse, Daniel approached her with something wrapped in brown paper. "A Christmas gift," he said, pressing it into her hands. "I hope it is not too forward of me." Clara unwrapped the package carefully and gasped. It was a book, but not just any book. It was a beautiful leather-bound volume of Emily Dickinson's poems, clearly expensive, the kind of thing that would have had to be ordered from San Francisco or even further east. "Mr. Sullivan, I cannot accept this. It is too much." "Please," he said softly. "You have given me so much these past months. You have opened up whole worlds I never knew existed. Let me give you this small thing in return." She looked up at him, at the sincerity in his face, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "It is the most thoughtful gift I have ever received, Clara." He said her name for the first time, dropping the formal Miss Oliverson, and the sound of it on his lips made her heart race. "I need to tell you something. These lessons, getting to spend time with you twice a week, it has become the most important part of my life. But it is not just about the learning anymore. It is about you." The schoolhouse had emptied out around them without her noticing. They stood in the lamplight, surrounded by the decorations the children had made, paper stars and strings of popcorn, and Clara knew this was a moment that would change everything. "I know I am just a ranch hand," Daniel continued, his voice low and urgent. "I do not have wealth or status. But I want to learn, Clara. I want to be worthy of you. You say you are too educated for most men, that your intelligence makes you unmarriageable. Then teach me. Teach me how to be the kind of man who can stand beside you as an equal. Teach me how to love you the way you deserve to be loved." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. In all her life, no one had ever said anything like this to her. No man had ever asked her to teach him how to love her, had ever seen her education not as an obstacle but as something precious to be honored. "Daniel," she said, and it felt right to use his given name, to drop the pretense of formality that had protected her heart. "You do not need to be taught how to love me. You have already shown me more respect and understanding than any man I have ever known. You already know how." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Then let me court you properly. Let me prove to this town and to you that an educated woman and a cowboy can make a life together." "Yes," Clara breathed. "Yes, I would like that very much." Their courtship scandalized half the town and delighted the other half. The more conservative residents clucked their tongues at the sight of the schoolteacher walking out with a simple ranch hand, saying she could have aimed higher, could have waited for a businessman or a lawyer to come along. But there were others, particularly among the working families, who saw something inspiring in the match. Here was an educated woman who did not look down on honest labor, and a hard-working man who valued learning and self-improvement. They were proof that the old class divisions did not have to hold in the American West, that people could choose their own paths. Daniel continued his lessons, but now they spent time together outside the schoolhouse as well. He took Clara riding on Sunday afternoons, showing her the desert landscape that had become his home. She had never been comfortable on horseback, but with Daniel's patient instruction, she learned to trust the animal beneath her and even to enjoy the freedom of movement across the open land. He showed her hidden springs where green things grew in defiance of the arid soil, and rocky outcroppings where ancient peoples had left paintings on the stone. The desert, which had seemed so harsh and empty when she first arrived, began to reveal its subtle beauties. In turn, Clara introduced Daniel to the world of ideas and culture she loved so much. They read together in the evenings, taking turns with passages from great works of literature. She taught him about history and philosophy, science and art. But what surprised her most was how much she learned from him. Daniel had a practical wisdom born of hard experience, an understanding of animal behavior, and weather patterns and human nature that no book could teach. He could look at the sky and predict rain 3 days hence, could gentle a spooked horse with nothing but patience and soft words, could read the signs of the land like she read pages of text. "We balance each other," Clara said one evening as they sat on the schoolhouse steps watching the sun set in shades of orange and gold. "Your practical knowledge and my book learning, your understanding of the natural world and my study of human culture, we make each other more complete." Daniel took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I never thought I would find someone like you, someone who sees me as I am and does not want me to be something different, someone who makes me want to be better while accepting me as I am right now." "I feel the same," Clara admitted. "In Boston, I was always trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less challenging. Here with you, I can be fully myself." As winter deepened, their relationship deepened as well. They had not spoken yet of marriage, but Clara felt it hovering between them, a possibility that thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. She had come to Mojave planning to stay for 1 year, to fulfill her contract, and then perhaps move on to another frontier town. But now the thought of leaving made her chest ache. The children needed her. The school needed her. And most of all, she needed Daniel. On a cold night in January 1885, Daniel arrived at the schoolhouse with a troubled expression. Clara knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, setting aside the papers she had been grading. "The Riverside Ranch is being sold," he said without preamble. "New owner is bringing in his own crew. We are all being let go at the end of February." Clara felt her stomach drop. "What will you do?" "I have been thinking about that." Daniel began to pace the small schoolhouse, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I have saved most of my wages these past years. I have enough to buy some land, start my own small spread. It would not be much at first, maybe just enough for a few dozen head of cattle, but it would be mine." "That sounds wonderful," Clara said, trying to understand why he looked so worried. "It would mean staying in Mojave, putting down roots, building something permanent." He stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Clara, before I make that decision, I need to know if you plan to stay. Your contract with the school is up in June. Will you go back to Boston, or will you consider making California your home?" This was the question that had been haunting Clara for weeks. Her father had written several times, urging her to return home, saying she had proven her point and it was time to settle down properly. But the thought of going back to Boston, to the narrow social expectations and the men who found her intelligence threatening, filled her with dread. "I want to stay," she said firmly. "I want to sign another contract with the school. I want to build a life here. And us." Daniel's voice was quiet but intense. "Where do we fit into that life you are building?" Clara stood and crossed to him, taking both his hands in hers. "You are the heart of that life, Daniel. These months with you have been the happiest I have ever known. You make me feel valued and understood in a way no one else ever has. Then marry me." The words came out in a rush, as though he had been holding them back for too long. "I know it is not the proposal you might have imagined, no fancy dinner or expensive ring. But I love you, Clara. I love your brilliant mind and your passionate heart. I love the way you care about these children and believe education can change the world. I love how you look at the desert sunset like it is the first time every evening. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life learning from you and loving you." "Yes," Clara said, and this time the tears did fall, streaming down her cheeks as she smiled up at him. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized. Not the polite proposals of convenience she had received in Boston, not the sense of settling or compromising. This was a partnership of equals, two people who made each other stronger and more complete. They were married on a Sunday afternoon in late March at the small church in Mojave. The whole town turned out for the wedding, even those who had initially been skeptical of the match. Clara wore a simple dress of cream-colored muslin that she had sewn herself with help from the boarding house keeper. She carried wildflowers that Daniel had picked that morning from the desert, small brave blooms of purple and yellow that seemed to capture the spirit of their love thriving in unlikely circumstances. Beautiful, because of and not despite the harsh environment. Daniel stood at the altar in new clothes, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. When the preacher asked if he took Clara to be his wife, his "I do" rang out clear and strong, a promise made before God and the community. And when it was her turn, Clara spoke her vows with equal conviction, pledging herself to this man who had seen past her education to the woman beneath, who had asked her to teach him how to love her, and then had shown her he already knew. The celebration afterward was held at the largest saloon in town, temporarily transformed with decorations and long tables laden with food. There was music and dancing, and Clara found herself whirled around the floor by Daniel, and then by a succession of townspeople who wanted to wish them well. The ranch hands from Riverside came, Daniel's former co-workers who had become his friends. The families of her students brought gifts, practical things like quilts and cooking pots and sacks of flour. It was not the elegant society wedding her mother had once imagined for her, but it was real and warm and full of genuine affection. As the sun set and the party continued, Daniel and Clara slipped away to the small house he had built on the land he purchased just outside town. It was modest, just 3 rooms, but he had worked on it every spare moment for the past 2 months, determined to have it ready for their wedding day. Clara walked through the space, marveling at the care he had taken. There were shelves for her books, a large window in what would be the main room to let in plenty of light for reading, a sturdy table where they could share meals, and where she could prepare lessons for school. "It is perfect," she said, turning to find him watching her with an expression of mingled hope and nervousness. "I want you to be happy here," Daniel said. "I want you to have everything you need." Clara crossed to him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I have everything I need right here. You understand that, do not you? I did not need a mansion in Boston or a life of leisure. I needed someone who would value my mind as much as my heart, someone who would be my partner in every sense of the word." He kissed her then, gentle at first and then with growing passion, and Clara felt herself respond with an intensity that surprised her. She had always been cerebral, living in her head more than her body, but with Daniel, she discovered a physical connection that matched their intellectual and emotional bond. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that went beyond words or thoughts into something more primal and profound. In the weeks that followed, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Clara continued teaching at the schoolhouse, now introducing herself as Mrs. Sullivan with a quiet pride. Daniel worked his small ranch, building up his herd gradually, doing most of the work himself, but occasionally hiring help for the bigger jobs. In the evenings, they came together in their little house, sharing meals and conversation, continuing the lessons that had brought them together in the first place. But their education of each other had evolved beyond formal lessons. Now it was a constant exchange, a flowing back and forth of knowledge and experience. Clara learned to brand cattle and mend fences, to churn butter and preserve food for the winter. Daniel continued to read voraciously, but now he also debated philosophy with Clara over breakfast, quoted poetry while they worked side by side in the garden, applied mathematical principles to calculating the best grazing rotation for his small herd. The town watched this unusual couple with growing respect. Clara was invited to give lectures at the church on Sunday evenings, speaking about literature and history and science to audiences of adults who had never had the opportunity for much formal education. Daniel became known as the thinking cowboy, the ranch hand who could discuss Aristotle as easily as cattle prices, and other young men in town began to follow his example, seeking out learning and self-improvement. In June of 1885, Clara signed a new contract with the Mojave School Board, committing to another 2 years of teaching. The board members, who had been so skeptical of her when she first arrived, now spoke of her with genuine appreciation. Attendance at the school had increased, and several students had expressed ambitions of continuing their education beyond the basics, perhaps even attending college someday. Clara's passion for learning had proven contagious. That summer brought challenges they had not anticipated. A drought settled over the Mojave Desert, more severe than anything the old-timers could remember. Water became scarce, and Daniel's cattle suffered. Clara watched her husband struggle, saw the worry lines deepen around his eyes as he calculated their dwindling resources. But she also saw his determination, his refusal to give up even when things looked bleak. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch of their little house watching the sun set over the parched land, Clara broached a subject that had been on her mind for weeks. "I could go back to teaching at a school in a larger town," she said quietly. "Somewhere with a better salary. We could use the extra money to help the ranch through this dry spell." Daniel turned to look at her, and she was surprised to see not gratitude but something closer to frustration in his expression. "Is that what you think I want? For you to give up the work you love, the students who need you, just to bail me out of a tough situation?" "I want to help," Clara protested. "We are partners, remember? Your problems are my problems." "Exactly, partners, which means we face this together, but we do not sacrifice who we are to do it." He reached for her hand. "You are a teacher, Clara. It is not just what you do, it is who you are. I will not have you give that up for me, any more than I would give up ranching if you asked me to become a shopkeeper." "Then what do? We get creative. We adapt. We survive." He smiled at her, and despite the worry in his eyes, there was confidence there too. "You taught me that, actually. Remember when we were reading about Darwin and natural selection? It is not the strongest that survive, but the most adaptable. We will adapt." And they did. Daniel sold off some of his cattle before the drought could claim them, keeping only his best breeding stock. He took on additional work, hiring himself out to other ranchers who needed experienced hands. Clara started tutoring students privately in the evenings, children from wealthier families who could afford to pay for advanced lessons. Together, they tightened their belts and made sacrifices, but they also found joy in the small things: the evenings spent reading together, the shared satisfaction of a good meal cooked from their dwindling supplies, the comfort of falling asleep in each other's arms. The drought broke in October with 3 days of steady rain that turned the desert temporarily green. Daniel's relief was palpable, and Clara felt her own tension ease as she watched him survey his land with renewed hope. They had made it through their first real crisis as a married couple, and they had done it together, without resentment or blame. That winter, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a complicated mix of emotions. She was overjoyed at the prospect of a child, but she also worried about the practical implications. How would she continue teaching? Would the school board allow a woman with an infant to remain in her position? Would she have to choose between motherhood and her calling as an educator? Daniel's response surprised her. "We will figure it out," he said simply. "Plenty of women work and raise children. It will not be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. And Clara, you are going to be an amazing mother. You know why? Because you already are an amazing teacher. You know how to help young minds grow and develop. You will just be doing it with our child as well as your students." His confidence bolstered her own. Together they made plans. Daniel would adjust his work schedule to be home more in the early months. They would find a woman in town to help with childcare when Clara was teaching. They would be creative and adaptable, just as they had been during the drought. Clara continued teaching through the winter and into the spring of 1886. Her expanding waistline, a source of gentle teasing from her students and their families. She was determined to work as long as possible, preparing detailed lesson plans for the substitute teacher who would take over during her confinement. The school board, much to her relief, had agreed to hold her position and allow her to return after the baby was born. On a warm evening in May, Clara went into labor. Daniel rode into town to fetch the midwife, then paced outside their bedroom as the hours stretched on. Clara had thought she understood pain from reading medical texts, but the reality of childbirth was something beyond her experience or imagination. Yet even in the midst of it, she found herself thinking of the thousands of women throughout history who had done this, who had survived this, and she drew strength from that long chain of mothers stretching back through time. Their son was born as the sun rose, his first cries mingling with the song of birds welcoming the new day. Daniel came into the room, his face pale but his eyes bright with unshed tears, and Clara placed their baby in his arms. "David," she said softly. "I would like to name him David if you agree." "David Sullivan," Daniel repeated, gazing down at the tiny face with an expression of wonder. "It is a strong name, a good name." Motherhood transformed Clara in ways she had not expected. The fierce love she felt for her son was almost frightening in its intensity. But she also discovered that Daniel had been right. Being a mother did not erase her identity as a teacher and scholar. Instead, it added another dimension to who she was. She read to David from the time he was days old, sang him songs in Latin and French, told him stories about history and science and literature. And when she returned to teaching in September, she found herself approaching her work with renewed empathy, understanding on a deeper level what her students' mothers experienced, the daily juggling act of caring for children while managing households and often working as well. The next few years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. David grew from infant to toddler to curious young boy, asking endless questions that delighted his parents. The small ranch prospered, not making them wealthy but providing a comfortable living. Clara's reputation as a teacher spread beyond Mojave, and she was asked to consult with other frontier schools about curriculum and methods. Daniel expanded his herd and began raising horses as well as cattle, discovering he had a gift for training. On a September evening in 1889, as they celebrated their 4th wedding anniversary, Clara reflected on how much had changed since she first arrived in Mojave 5 years earlier. She had come here feeling like a misfit, too educated for her own good, uncertain of her place in the world. Now she had a home, a family, a community that valued her contributions. She had a husband who loved her mind as much as her heart, who had asked her to teach him how to love her, and then had spent every day since proving he already knew. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist as they stood on their porch watching the sunset. "About how happy I am," Clara said honestly. "About how this was not the life I imagined for myself, but it is so much better than anything I could have planned." "Same here," Daniel murmured against her hair. "I was just a cowboy working for wages, never thinking beyond the next season. Then you came along and opened up the whole world to me. You showed me I could be more than I thought possible." "We did that for each other," Clara corrected gently. "You showed me that intelligence without human connection is empty. That education means nothing if it does not help us understand and love each other better. You taught me how to be fully human, Daniel, not just a collection of facts and theories. Then I guess we are both pretty good teachers." Clara laughed and turned in his arms to kiss him. From inside the house came the sound of David playing, chattering to himself in that mix of real words and nonsense syllables that 4-year-olds favored. It was a perfect moment, one of those golden slices of time that seemed to hold all the happiness of the world. In the spring of 1890, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news brought no anxiety, only joy. They had learned how to balance work and family, how to support each other through challenges, how to build a life together that honored both their individual callings and their shared partnership. A second child would be welcomed with open arms. Their daughter was born in December, a Christmas baby they named Caroline. David was enchanted with his little sister, wanting to help with everything, and Clara and Daniel marveled at the family they had created. 2 children, a boy and a girl, healthy and happy, growing up in a home filled with love and books and wide desert skies. As the new decade began, Clara made a decision that would have shocked her younger self. She cut back on her teaching, taking on only part-time work at the school and focusing more on private tutoring and educational consulting. It was not that she loved teaching any less, but she had come to understand that there were different seasons in life, different ways to contribute and make a difference. Right now, with 2 young children, she wanted to be more present at home. But she also knew that in time, as David and Caroline grew older, she would return to full-time teaching, would continue to shape young minds and inspire love of learning. Daniel supported her decision completely, just as she supported him when he decided to run for the town council in 1891. The cowboy who had once thought himself uneducated and unimportant now stood before the citizens of Mojave and spoke eloquently about the need for better schools, for a library, for opportunities that would allow their frontier town to grow and prosper. He won the election handily, and Clara felt a fierce pride watching him take his oath of office. Together they became pillars of the Mojave community. Clara organized a reading circle for women and a lecture series for the whole town. Daniel pushed through funding for a new schoolhouse, larger and better equipped than the old one. They hosted gatherings at their ranch, bringing together people from all walks of life: ranchers and shopkeepers, teachers and laborers, old settlers and new arrivals. Their home became known as a place where ideas were exchanged as freely as news and gossip, where learning was celebrated, and where everyone was welcome regardless of their formal education. On a spring day in 1893, Clara stood in the new schoolhouse and looked around at the bright space, the rows of books, the maps and charts and scientific equipment. 9 years ago, she had arrived in Mojave with 2 trunks and a dream of making a difference. She had been lonely and uncertain, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Now she was surrounded by people she loved, doing work that mattered, living a life richer and fuller than anything she had imagined. David came running up to her, his 7-year-old energy boundless. "Mama, Papa said I could help him with the horses today. Can I go?" Clara knelt down to his level. "Did you finish your reading practice?" "Yes, Mama, I read 2 whole chapters." "Then yes, you may go. But remember what we talked about: listen carefully to your father's instructions and be gentle with the animals." David hugged her quickly and ran off, and Clara watched him go with a smile. He had Daniel's energy and her curiosity, a combination that promised great things for his future. Caroline, now 2.5, was showing signs of being equally bright, already recognizing letters and numbers, endlessly interested in how things worked. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Clara looked at the faces of the people she loved most in the world and felt a contentment so deep it was almost like a physical presence in the room. Daniel was explaining to David something about horse training, using it as a jumping-off point to discuss patience and trust and reading non-verbal cues. Caroline was attempting to eat her food independently, making a mess but determined to do it herself. This was what happiness looked like, Clara realized. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but this ordinary evenings filled with conversation and laughter and love. After the children were in bed, Clara and Daniel sat together on their porch as they had done countless times over the years. The desert night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky in brilliant profusion. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked suddenly. "Staying here, marrying me, giving up the kind of life you could have had in Boston?" Clara looked at him in genuine surprise. "Never. Not for a single moment." "Daniel, You gave me something I never had in Boston, the freedom to be fully myself. Back there, I was always too much or not enough, too educated or not feminine enough. Here with you, I am just right. I am valued for who I am, not judged for who I am not. You gave me that too, Daniel said softly. When I met you, I was just a cowboy. I had no idea I could be more. You saw potential in me that I did not see in myself. We saved each other, Clara said simply. In a way, we both came to Mojave looking for something. You were looking for a way to grow beyond the limitations of your circumstances. I was looking for a place where my education would not be a burden. And we found each other, and we found a way to build a life that honors both of us. Daniel pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Clara thought back to that September day in 1884 when she had stepped off the train in Mojave, scared and excited and determined to prove herself. She thought about the first time she had met Daniel, the way he had looked at her with respect rather than dismissal. She thought about their lessons together, the courtship, the wedding, the children, all the moments large and small that had brought them to this point. "I love you," she said, the words inadequate to express the depth of what she felt. "I love you for asking me to teach you, for valuing what I had to offer, for seeing me as a whole person rather than just an educated woman or just a potential wife. I love you for being my partner in every sense of the word." "Then I guess I learned the lesson after all," Daniel said with a smile in his voice. "You taught me how to love you, Clara." And it turns out the answer was simple: love you with respect, with honesty, with a willingness to grow and change together. Love you by being worthy of your love in return. "You were always worthy," Clara whispered. "You just needed to believe it." The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, joys and sorrows. In 1895, Daniel's small ranch had grown successful enough that he was able to hire permanent help, 3 young men eager to learn from him the way he had once been eager to learn from Clara. He taught them not just about cattle and horses, but about literature and philosophy, about the importance of education and self-improvement. They became something of a phenomenon in the area, the cowboy crew that read Shakespeare and debated Socrates around the campfire. Clara expanded her work as well, becoming a regional consultant for rural schools throughout California. She traveled occasionally, giving talks and workshops, helping other teachers develop their curricula and teaching methods. She wrote articles for educational journals about the unique challenges and opportunities of frontier education. Her reputation grew, and she received offers to move to larger cities, to take positions at established schools with better pay and more prestige. But she always turned them down. Mojave was her home now, and she had no desire to leave. In 1897, tragedy struck when a fever swept through Mojave. Caroline, now 7 years old, fell ill, and for a terrifying week, Clara and Daniel took turns sitting by her bedside, sponging her forehead with cool water, willing her to fight through the sickness. Clara found herself making desperate bargains with God, promising anything if only her daughter would survive. Daniel held her when she broke down crying, and they drew strength from each other, refusing to give up hope. Caroline recovered, but the experience left them both shaken. The reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly happiness could be snatched away, made them hold their children a little tighter, appreciate their time together a little more deeply. It also inspired Clara to write a proposal to the town council for a proper hospital in Mojave. The nearest doctor was 10 miles away, and the nearest hospital was 50. People died from illnesses and injuries that could have been treated if only they had access to proper medical care. Her proposal was passionate and detailed, full of statistics and examples, and Daniel used his position on the council to push it through. Within a year, Mojave had its first small hospital, staffed by a doctor and 2 nurses, a place that would save countless lives in the years to come. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1895, Clara and Daniel took a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their honeymoon. They left David and Caroline with Clara's colleague from the school, a woman who had become a close friend over the years, and set off on the adventure. The city was a revelation so different from Boston but equally exciting in its own way. They attended the theater, visited museums, ate at restaurants, walked along the waterfront, and spent long hours talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as they were preparing for bed in their hotel room, Daniel pulled out a small box and handed it to Clara. "I never gave you a proper engagement ring," he said. "We got married so quickly and money was tight, but I have been saving and I wanted you to have this." Clara opened the box to find a simple gold band with a single small diamond. It was not ostentatious or expensive, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "Daniel, you did not have to do this. I wanted to. I wanted you to have something that shows the world you are loved, that you are treasured. You are my wife, my partner, my best friend. You are the mother of my children and the love of my life. You deserve to have a symbol of that." Clara slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. She looked up at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "You are the best man I have ever known. Do you understand that? The best man. Not because you have read all the right books or made a fortune or achieved great fame, but because you are kind and honest and true. Because you keep your promises and you treat people with respect, and you never stop trying to learn and grow. I am so proud to be your wife." They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that spoke of 10 years of partnership, of shared joys and sorrows, of a bond that had only deepened with time. And Clara thought that this was what she had been searching for all along, though she had not known it when she left Boston. Not just intellectual stimulation or professional fulfillment, but a love that honored all of who she was, a partnership that made her stronger and more complete. As the new century approached, Clara and Daniel found themselves reflecting on how much the world had changed. David was now 14, a tall young man who showed every sign of inheriting his parents' best qualities: his father's work ethic and integrity, his mother's intellectual curiosity and love of learning. He had announced his intention to attend college, to study agriculture and animal husbandry, so he could return to Mojave and help modernize farming and ranching practices in the region. Caroline, at 10, was quieter but equally determined, fascinated by medicine and already talking about becoming a doctor, inspired by the physician who had helped establish the hospital Clara had advocated for. On the last day of 1899, the Sullivan family gathered on their porch to watch the sunset and welcome the new century. Clara stood between her husband and her children, and she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life they had built together. "Mama," Caroline asked, "what do you think the new century will bring?" Clara considered the question carefully, not wanting to give a pat answer. "Change," she said finally. "The world is transforming faster than ever before. There will be new inventions, new ideas, new possibilities. It will be exciting and sometimes frightening. But we will face it together," David added. "That is what you and Papa taught us, that we are stronger together than we are alone." "Exactly right," Daniel said, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "Whatever comes, we face it as a family, supporting each other, learning from each other, growing together." As midnight approached, Clara thought back to that day 16 years ago when she had arrived in Mojave, uncertain and alone. She thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place, to this man, to this life. She thought about how she had been told she was too educated for most men, how her father had despaired of her ever finding happiness, how she had come west feeling like a misfit. And then she thought about Daniel's words on that long-ago evening in the schoolhouse. "Then teach me how to love you." Those words had changed everything. They had been the beginning of a love story that defied expectations, a partnership between an educated schoolteacher and a cowboy that had scandalized some and inspired others. But more than that, they had been an acknowledgement that love is not about one person changing to fit the other's expectations, but about two people choosing to grow together, to learn from each other, to build something new that honors both of their truths. "I love you," Clara said to Daniel as the new century began, as fireworks lit up the desert sky over Mojave. "Thank you for asking me to teach you, for valuing what I had to offer, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you for saying yes," Daniel replied. "For taking a chance on a cowboy who did not know much but was willing to learn. For seeing in me what I could not see in myself. For being my wife, my partner, my home." They kissed as their children cheered, and Clara felt complete. This was her happily ever after. Not a fairy tale ending, but something real and true, and earned through years of hard work and compromise and unwavering commitment. She was a teacher and a mother, a scholar and a frontier woman, too educated for most men but exactly right for this one man who had asked her to teach him how to love her, and then had spent every day since proving he already knew. The years that followed brought continued growth and change. The town of Mojave grew as the new century progressed, expanding from a rough frontier settlement into a proper community with paved streets and electric lights, a library and a theater, businesses and schools. Clara and Daniel grew with it, adapting to the changes while holding fast to the values that had brought them together: education, hard work, mutual respect, and love. David went off to college in 1902, and Clara felt the bittersweet pain of watching her firstborn leave home. But she also felt pride, knowing she and Daniel had raised a young man who was prepared to meet the world with confidence and compassion. He returned during summers to help on the ranch, and the conversations around the dinner table were richer for his new learning, the back-and-forth exchange of ideas that had always been the hallmark of the Sullivan household. Caroline followed her brother to college in 1906, heading to San Francisco to study medicine. It was a bold choice for a woman, but by then the world was beginning to shift, and opportunities were opening up that had not existed when Clara was young. Still, it would not be easy, and Clara worried. But Daniel reminded her that their daughter had inherited her mother's intelligence and determination, her father's stubbornness and work ethic. She would succeed. With both children away at school, Clara and Daniel found themselves in a new phase of life. The house felt empty at first, too quiet without the constant noise and activity of young people. But gradually they adjusted, rediscovering each other in new ways, returning to some of the rhythms of their early married life: long conversations in the evening, reading together, exploring ideas and dreams. Clara returned to full-time teaching in 1907, taking over as headmistress of the Mojave school. It was a position of significant responsibility, overseeing not just her own classroom, but the entire educational program of the growing town. She threw herself into the work with renewed passion, implementing new teaching methods, advocating for higher salaries for teachers, pushing for expanded curricula that included science and history and literature, alongside the basics of reading and arithmetic. Daniel continued to thrive as well. His ranch was now one of the most successful in the region, and he had developed a reputation as an expert in horse breeding. but he had not forgotten his roots, and he made a point of hiring young men who reminded him of his younger self, hardworking but uneducated, hungry for the chance to prove themselves. He taught them about ranching, but he also encouraged them to read and learn, to think beyond the immediate demands of the work. Several of them went on to start their own spreads, crediting Daniel with giving them not just job skills but a broader vision of what their lives could be. In 1910, on a warm spring evening, Clara and Daniel celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children came home for the occasion, David with his new wife in tow, a bright young woman he had met at college who shared his passion for agriculture. Caroline came with her medical degree newly completed, and news that she had accepted a position at a hospital in Los Angeles. The house was full of laughter and love. 3 generations gathered to celebrate the marriage that had started it all. As Clara looked around the table at the faces she loved, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had created this together with Daniel. They had built a family, a home, a life that mattered. They had shown their children and their community that education and hard work, respect and love, could overcome any obstacle. They had proven that an educated woman and a cowboy could not only make a marriage work, but could create something beautiful and lasting. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Clara and Daniel walked out to the place where they had first stood together so many years ago, looking at the land he had just purchased, dreaming of the future they would build. 25 years, Daniel said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I walked into that schoolhouse and asked you to teach me. Other times it feels like we have always been together. Both things are true, Clara replied, leaning into his warmth. Time is strange that way. The years pass so quickly, but they are also full of 1,000 moments, each one building on the last. We have lived a lifetime together, Daniel, and it has been a good life. The best life, he corrected. I have no regrets, Clara, not a single one. Every choice we made, every challenge we faced, it all led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be. Clara thought about the young woman she had been, arriving in Mojave with her books and her dreams, so uncertain about her place in the world. She thought about the young man Daniel had been, working hard but believing himself limited by his lack of education. And she thought about how they had found each other, how they had chosen each other, how they had built a love that had sustained them through a quarter-century of changes and challenges. You know what I realized, Clara said softly. That day you asked me to teach you how to love me, you did not really need teaching at all. You already knew how. You knew how to see me as a whole person, to value my mind and my heart. You knew how to be a partner, to support without smothering, to challenge without diminishing. What you needed was not teaching but permission to believe you were worthy, permission to reach for more than you thought possible. And I needed the same thing. I needed permission to be fully myself, to stop trying to make myself smaller to fit other people's expectations. We gave each other that permission and everything else followed. I never thought of it that way, Daniel said, but you are right. We taught each other, but mostly we gave each other permission to be who we really were, and that made all the difference. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the stars, remembering all that had been and dreaming of all that was still to come. There would be grandchildren soon, David and his wife had hinted. There would be new challenges as they aged, new changes in the world around them. But they would face it all together, just as they always had, partners in every sense of the word. In the end, Clara reflected, love was not about one person teaching another or one person changing to fit the other's mold. Real love was about 2 people choosing to grow together, to honor each other's truths, to build something that was greater than either of them could have created alone. She had come to Mojave searching for a place where her education would be valued rather than feared, and she had found that. But more than that, she had found a man who loved her not despite her intelligence but because of it, who saw her education not as an obstacle but as a gift to be treasured. And Daniel had found a woman who saw past his rough exterior to the man beneath, who recognized his intelligence and integrity, who believed he could be more than a cowboy working for wages and helped him believe it too. Together they had proven that love could bridge any divide, that an educated woman and a self-taught rancher could create a partnership of equals, that the rough frontier of the American West could be a place where minds and hearts grew together. As they walked back to their house, hand in hand under the vast desert stars, Clara felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. This was what happiness looked like, not a single perfect moment, but a lifetime of moments, good and bad, joyful and sorrowful, all woven together into a rich tapestry of shared experience. This was what it meant to be fully alive, fully human, fully loved. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. David and his wife had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who spent their summers on the ranch learning about animals and land management from their grandfather. Caroline became one of the first female surgeons in California, blazing a trail for other women who wanted to enter the medical profession. She never married, dedicating herself instead to her work, but she found deep satisfaction in the lives she saved and the barriers she broke. Clara continued teaching until she was 65, retiring in 1926 after more than 4 decades in education. Her retirement celebration was attended by hundreds of former students, many now adults with children of their own, all of them eager to honor the teacher who had shaped their lives. They shared stories of lessons learned, of books that had opened their minds, of a woman who had believed in the power of education to transform individuals and communities. Clara listened with tears streaming down her face, humbled by the impact she had made, grateful beyond words for the chance to do work she loved in a place she had come to call home. Daniel remained active on the ranch well into his 70s, still riding out to check on cattle, still training horses, still mentoring young men who came to work for him. He moved a little slower and tired a little more easily, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit strong. He and Clara spent their days together, falling into a comfortable rhythm of conversation and companionship, still learning from each other after all these years. On a cool evening in November 1934, as they celebrated their 49th wedding anniversary, Clara looked across the table at Daniel and marveled at how much they had shared. Nearly 50 years of marriage, 2 children, 5 grandchildren, thousands of students taught, a community transformed. It had been a rich and full life, far beyond anything she had imagined that day she stepped off the train in Mojave. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, and Clara smiled at how well he could read her even now. "I am thinking about time," she said. "About how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. The world is so different from when we married. There are automobiles and airplanes, radio and motion pictures. Women can vote now. The frontier is gone, replaced by cities and highways. But you and I, we are still the same. Still talking, still learning, still loving. That is because what we have is not dependent on external things," Daniel said. "It is not about where we live or what year it is. It is about who we are together, how we choose to show up for each other every day. That does not change." "I wish we could have another 50 years, Clara said wistfully. "So do I, but we will take whatever time we are given and make it count." Daniel reached across the table to take her hand. "That is what you taught me, you know. To make every moment count, to never stop learning and growing, to approach life with curiosity and passion. You gave me that gift, Clara. You took a cowboy who thought his life was already written and showed him he could write his own story. We wrote it together, Clara corrected gently. Every word, every chapter, and it has been the greatest story of my life. They spent their 50th anniversary in 1935 surrounded by family and friends, a great celebration that brought together people from all over California. Former students came, some now grandparents themselves. Ranch hands Daniel had mentored, many now successful businessmen and ranchers, came to pay their respects. Teachers Clara had trained, doctors Caroline had worked with, professors who had taught David, all gathered to honor this remarkable couple who had shown an entire community what true partnership looked like. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Clara and Daniel sat once more on their porch, looking out at the land they had tended for half a century. The desert was unchanged, still stark and beautiful, still holding its secrets and its surprises, but everything else had transformed. Mojave was now a thriving town with thousands of residents, good schools and hospitals, businesses and cultural institutions. And much of that growth could be traced back to the work Clara and Daniel had done, the example they had set, the values they had championed. 50 years, Daniel said, shaking his head in wonder. 50 years since you agreed to marry a cowboy who barely knew how to read good literature. 50 years since a cowboy looked at me and saw not a problem to be solved but a person to be cherished, Clara replied. 50 years since you asked me to teach you how to love me, and then proved you already knew how. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set in shades of orange and pink and gold, painting the desert in colors that took their breath away, even after thousands of sunsets watched together. And Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the young woman who had been too educated for most men and the young man who had been brave enough to ask her to teach him, about all the years of partnership and growth and love that had followed. I love you, she said, the words as true and necessary now as they had been 50 years ago. I will always love you, and I will always love you, Daniel replied. In this life and whatever comes after, you are my greatest adventure, Clara Sullivan. My greatest teacher, my greatest love, my greatest joy. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt complete. This was her happily ever after. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better, a real and true and hard-won happiness built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and abiding love. She had come to the Wild West seeking a place where her education would be valued, and she had found so much more. She had found home. She had found purpose. And most of all, she had found a love that honored all of who she was and made her more than she could have been alone. The story of the schoolteacher who was too educated for most men and the cowboy who said, "Then teach me how to love you," became something of a legend in Mojave, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be when two people were brave enough to defy expectations and build something new. Their grandchildren would tell the story to their children, and those children would tell it to their children, and with each telling the essential truth remained the same, that real love sees and values the whole person, that education and hard work can transform lives, that an unlikely partnership can become the foundation for a legacy that endures. Clara and Daniel Sullivan lived out their days in the little house on the edge of Mojave, surrounded by the family and community they had nurtured, secure in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved well, and made a difference that would outlast them. And when the end came, they faced it as they had faced everything else together, with courage and grace, grateful for every moment they had been given, every lesson learned, every challenge overcome, every day of the remarkable life they had built side by side.